This video is now in session, and today I want to talk about what could occur if we made every single major territory of the United States, including Washington, D.C., into a state. So, this is not totally out of the question, especially with Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., but I just wanted to make more of an experimental video if we also included American Samoa, Guam, the Marianas Islands, Northern Marianas Islands, and as well as the Virgin Islands part of this federal government system. So what this would do is it would increase a lot the amount of Senate seats in the United States Senate. So there would be an increase of 5, 6. There would be an increase of 12 Senate seats. That's a lot of Senate seats. That would go from 100 to 112, and that would mean that 56 would be the new majority. And that is a lot of seats in comparison to what we have now. So if we overlay the 2020 presidential election results onto this map, then we would have around 302 for Democrats and as well as 236 for Republicans. Now I have not edited this to make it part of the 2024 electoral map, but I will do that right now. So this is what the map would look like, and we have 19 electoral votes left. For Washington, D.C., we already know how it voted because D.C. has an amendment, or there's an amendment saying that D.C. is eligible for federal elections because they do technically pay federal taxes or taxes to the federal government. So it's very democratic, as we've seen in past presidential elections. Of the elections where they were eligible to vote, they have always voted for Democrats by large margins. Even during the Reagan era, they still voted for people like Jimmy Carter or Walter Mondale by very large margins. In fact, almost 73 percentage points ahead of Reagan. But anyway, I'm not trying to give a history lesson here. Let's go on to these 5 territories. So the Marianas Islands are actually, let's start with states that are, I guess, territories that you think would vote for Democrats. So American Samoa and not Virginia, I always think this is Virginia, the U.S. Virgin Islands, these would definitely be in favor for Democrats by a lot. Almost by more than safe margins at this point. Now, Puerto Rico, you'd think that'd be pretty democratic, in fact, very safe democratic, but a lot of the views of Puerto Ricans are actually pretty conservative. They very, very well align with the Republican Party, and as a result, Puerto Rico wouldn't be a safe democratic state. Now, by giving this information to you, you'd think that Puerto Rico would then be a Republican state, right? No. Even though they have conservative values, they still vote for the Democratic Party, mainly just because of, I guess, the voting patterns of other states, because they like to more align themselves more as Democrats, even though they are socially conservative. It's almost kind of like Florida, where a lot of Cuban Americans are socially conservative. Actually, this isn't a great example, but there are a lot of people in America who are socially conservative, but still vote for the Democratic Party, mainly just because they resonate more with the people in the Democratic Party. So as a result, I would give Puerto Rico a likely to lean status for the Democrats. Now let's talk about Guam and Marianas Islands, because again, you'd think that every single territory would be for Democrats, especially because these are near Hawaii. Well, they're not really near Hawaii, but the closest state is Hawaii, which is a very democratic state. But you'd be wrong to think that, especially with the Northern Marianas Islands. The Northern Marianas Islands is incredibly Republican. It is pretty Republican, and that's surprising, mainly because they're only just like a couple hundred miles north of Guam, which is more of a kind of swing state if it were to be a state. So Yeah, I would place it as tilt Democratic, primarily because based on looking at the gubernatorial elections in Guam, it's been flip flopping back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. 2018, Democrats flipped the governor position from Republican to Democrats, but in 2014, it was Republicans. In 2010, it was Republicans. 2006, Republicans. 2002, Republicans. 1998 is where we have Democrats, and then 1994 is where we also had Democrats. So actually, I would say this state is more of a tilt Republican state, but it still would be more of a swing state. And that's ultimately what this territory map would look like. I could see Marianas Islands as likely if Democrats would be the one to make the Marianas Islands a state, but otherwise I would see it more as a safe Republican state. So this is what the electoral map would look like: 316 for Democrats and 242 for Republicans. So this would ultimately help Democrats more, which is pretty important if we were to induct these into the United States, mainly because Democrats would no longer need Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, and they would still need Michigan, but they would not need Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. They would not need New Hampshire. They do need Nevada and every other state, but they wouldn't need these Rust Belt states plus New Hampshire, which are trending more and more Republican. So as a result, this is what the territories, making territories become a state does. But in my opinion, these territories deserve to be states, and that's not a Democratic viewpoint, or it's not a Democrat viewpoint. It's a Democratic viewpoint, mainly because if you're in the United States, one of the main reasons you come to the United States is because of our democracy. It's because we have the ability to vote for our own president and our own representatives without having to deal with attempted coups or something you would see in more of a developed country or in the Philippines. So that was deliberately a burn towards the Philippines because of Duterte. But anyway, that's a whole separate thing, not related to U.S. politics. Anyway, so yeah, all of these territories plus the Washington D.C. should become states. They deserve to become states. But at the same time, Republicans will definitely try to block any of these territories from becoming a state, with the exception of the Marianas Islands, because of how they view all of the other territories as democratic states. And this is mainly a political issue, and inducting states into the United States has always been a political issue. I know I said earlier that this would not be a history lesson, but let's do a quick history lesson. So, when Missouri wanted to become part of the United States, it had a choice. It could either become part of the Confederate States of America or the United States of America. And ultimately, it wanted to be part of, I believe, the Confederate States of America. And the important thing about that was, at that time, the amount of senators in the U.S. Senate, at least the composition, was half free slaves, half in affirmation of slaves. So by adding Missouri, that would mean that the slave states would have an advantage. So as a result, the Missouri Compromise did come into fruition, and Maine was added as a free state, so it would not tip the balance. Something similar could be done in this instance, but it would be much harder, mainly because Republicans would most likely still object, unless if like the Marianas Islands was added plus Guam, or Marianas Islands plus Puerto Rico. But if you add American Samoa, Virgin Islands, or Washington D.C., then they would most likely object to all three decisions. But right now, Democrats do have a trifecta or they have a federal trifecta. It is a very narrow trifecta, though. 222 House seats, 50 Senate seats, so exactly at the majority. And then they have the presidency, but it would only take one defection in the U.S. Senate in order for for something like D.C. statehood to not pass. Now, D.C. statehood was already passed in the 116th Congress in the House of Representatives. It didn't go into the Senate for a floor vote, but it is being brought back to the U.S. House of Representatives in the 117th Congress, which is the Congress we are currently in. That will most likely pass, but Going into the Senate, it's going to be very hard because Democrats would have to either convince Joe Manchin or Susan Collins to vote for DC statehood. And that would be a very tough decision for Joe Manchin, and that would be a decision Susan Collins would almost immediately reject, because that would be political suicide, as it would be giving Democrats 2 more Senate seats. For Joe Manchin, if he was in favor of DC statehood, that would not look good in the eyes of his constituents because he is the Democratic senator of West Virginia. And you have to know that Joe Manchin voted for Trump, for bills that Trump endorsed 51% of the time. So that's, he is more of a conservative Democrat. Some would even call him a faux Democrat or a fake Democrat, but I'm going to call him a conservative Democrat. And you also have to get senators like Kyrsten Sinema on board this issue. Now, John Tester, who is the Democratic senator from Montana, did get on board this issue, but Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, both senators from Rhode Island have not gotten onto DC statehood yet. I could see Rhode Island senators coming on board, but I'm not sure about Joe Manchin. For Kyrsten Sinema, there is a potential that she would be in favor of the Washington, D.C. statehood bill, but a compromise that Democrats could make is they could make a compromise with Marco Rubio and Rick Scott to have Puerto Rico become a state in tandem with the Washington, D.C., because both senators from Florida are in favor of Puerto Rico becoming a state. So if they combine Puerto Rico and D.C. in tandem, then that's a way Democrats could potentially get it passed, but otherwise I don't see the statehood happening for any of these territories anytime soon. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.